Hi. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Secure Boot AMAs. I'm Arden White, Principal Security Engineer, and you can start posting your questions to AKAMS AMA Secure Boot. And I'm going to pass off to Ivan Cardam.
Hi, good morning, good evening, good night. I'm Ivan Cardam. I work in WSD. I engineer fixes for the in-market Windows platforms and have been involved in Secure Boot effort for the last year. I'll pass it on to Jason.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jason Sandys. I work on the Intune product group, so here to answer any questions that are related to Intune and hopefully get you all going on your Secure Boot journey. Kevin, go ahead.
Hi, folks. Kevin Sullivan. Good to be back here on the Secure Boot AMA. I'm on our Windows ecosystem and commercial engagement team. My team works with our PC OEM partners on helping them build secure Windows PCs, including Secure Boot. I also have some great colleagues across our organization who work with our server and virtualization partners who have been helping in this effort as well.
Hi, folks. I'm Scott Schell. As you can tell from my background, I'm in a hotel room. I'm here in Paris attending the Modern Endpoint Management Summit. We're talking to a bunch of customers here about this Secure Boot key role. We've got our colleagues Prabhakar and Travis talking tomorrow about that, and we're meeting with a lot of customers and trying to help people get over this hump. Nice to see you, everyone.
So for our first question, what should we look for to know which devices we need to take action on versus what devices will be updated as part of high confidence? Scott, let's start with you.
So this is a question I got from a customer at the conference yesterday. And this is a great question because we are continually updating the high confidence list as we build confidence in more of the device buckets. But there is a little bit of nuance because there are some categories of devices where we're still analyzing more data, and it's likely that those devices will end up on the high confidence list soon. And customers are probably best off waiting on those devices. But there are other categories of devices where we already know that there are other states, and you should be looking for firmware updates from your OEM. So Arden, you said you had that list up. Can you read off those states real quick?
Sure. So high confidence, that should be obvious. If you see that, your device is probably already updated. Under observation needs more data. That's where we have data coming in on devices like the one you have, and we expect that we're going to be applying the updates on all of those devices. The ones that you should definitely pay attention to are temporarily paused, not supported, known limitation, and no data observed, action required. So no data observed, it's clearly that we're just not getting any telemetry data on that type of device. And then the other ones we've seen some issues with, and you definitely should, on those three categories, take action and talk with your OEMs.
Yeah, Scott, you mentioned some devices where you may need to get a firmware update from your OEM. One of the things that's happened since the last time we were on the AMA is many of our OEM partners for client, server, virtualization have posted updated and detailed websites that help customers get the information they need on which devices may need updates, what they're available for, direct download links. It's a pretty great customer guidance they've made available. And all of those are linked off of the website that you see there, as well as ak.ms/getsecureboot.
Yeah. One thing I would add to Scott's point, we're working very hard to try and get every device added to high confidence list. I think the How common the device configuration is can also play a role in your decision making to wait or not. So if you have devices that are common, like laptops that are off the shelves, the likelihood that you will be able to get to them is high. But if you have custom configuration, IoT devices, like something you put together, different parts, then that will be less common, and it'll be harder for us to reach the confidence we need to get there. So.
Okay, another question from the tech community. What do I have to do to get the new certificates to Windows 11 and server ISOs? Will they be integrated in new ISOs in the near future, or do I have to do something manually to add them?
So
I think so. We've been talking about this some. The certificates are all in the latest updates. So if the ISOs have the latest updates, they'll have the certificates. They'll have the boot manager, the new boot manager. The one thing that you will notice is that those ISOs are booting from the old boot manager, and when you install, you probably will see that the 2011 signed boot manager is there instead of the 2023 signed boot manager. We are we're adding support to automatically detect when the certificates are trusted and to apply that boot manager. And we will be in the future updating all the media that Microsoft produces to default to the 2023 boot manager, and that's coming in the future.
So one thing I was going to add to that is a lot of the media that comes out for devices comes from OEMs. So the OEMs build media for their devices, frequently have recovery media. And Kevin, do we have a date from OEMs when we expect them to have 2023 by default as the boot manager?
Many of them are tracking to certainly by the date that it expires. I think the priority for them is making sure that the devices they ship are compatible with the media that's out there, and vice versa as well.
Yeah, great question.
Okay, next question. We have Autopatch enabled on our devices, and the April update has already been deployed, yet Autopatch still reports a large quantity of devices needing the CERT update. Is Autopatch going to push those updates, or do we need to configure a setting?
So this goes back to what we were talking about just a while ago. It's about more than just does the device have the updates? The devices have all had the updates for more than a year. So these devices the updates have been on all of your devices for a long time. The question is whether the updates are installed into the UFI firmware. And that's a question of the confidence database that we talked about before. And the answer to that question is the answer to the question we gave at the beginning. It depends on what the status coming back is on that individual device. And I think Arden's answer to that question was perfect at the beginning.
But I think there's one piece to this, which is I don't think Autopatch is going to automatically apply. I think I haven't looked at what they're doing closely, but I think they're mostly reporting status. I don't think they will apply automatically.
No, it's not Autopatch applying. It's PM Tasks that actually does the application.
Sure.
But Autopatch just deploys the LCU, or Windows applies the LCU.
Yeah.
I was going to throw one quick thing in there as well, kind of tying the last two questions together. The question about the ISOs, a lot of folks, and it depends upon exactly the connotation there, but the question was, are the certificates in the ISOs? And that's not really the right way to look at it, right? And you just called this out, Scott. The certificates need to make it to the UFI firmware. That's the main key here. So there are pieces clearly that are part of Windows here, but we got to keep that part in mind. And that's a flow that I think some people just have missed, is that it's all about what's in the firmware. And that's why the vendors are part of this and making sure that that's something that's always top of mind in this as well.
And the firmware, and it's not Depends on the case, but also on the Pixie servers and whoever's serving boot managers as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Many facets.
Okay. I think we have a question for Jason. Is there an Intune export that can tell me if all of my global, I think that's expert, if can tell me if all of my global devices are on the new certs or the old ones? I don't overly care which devices are high confidence. I care about which ones are already done and which ones aren't.
Yeah, good question. And I think it is export. So one of the things in Intune is a lot of the reports or the data is actually exportable, and that's how it's typically actionable. There is a built-in report. The Autopatch team actually built it, but it is built into Intune that will show you the secure boot status. Offhand, I don't remember exactly what that report is called, but it is within the Autopatch reports. I'll go find it here in a second. Additionally, I know Arden, your team posted a way to use remediations within Intune as well, and that's out on the support site. And so you can use both. You can use a combination thereof, whichever one works best for you, or use them both, right? It doesn't really hurt anything to use them both. And so the remediation is ultimately from memory querying the registry. And the registry is what gives you that definitive, hey, is the certificate actually updated in the firmware or not? So.
Yeah, and that remediation documentation is on the Get, aka MS Get Secure Boot. And remember to post your questions to aka.ms AMA Secure Boot. So next question, what telemetry level should we have set in our org for the certs to properly install? Currently, we have them set to blocked here, and I know that is wrong, but I'm unsure what would be correct for this case. Is there any sort of guidance available for this? I think what the question's about is if customers want to opt into the control feature rollout for client devices, and that's not necessary, but if you do want to opt into that, where Microsoft actually targets the devices and updates the certificates on client devices, then you do need to turn on, I think it's called mandatory diagnostic data. It's the basic diagnostic data that the Windows supports.
Yeah, it would be recommended diagnostics would be the way. I would say also that as Arden put it well, like if you want CFR to potentially help update your devices, I wouldn't say that the telemetry setting you have is wrong. Obviously, you understand the needs of your organization, and we want to have options that work for whatever your configurations are, right? So it's also entirely possible that you can still get the certs updated if the configurations of devices that you have are common. Once we learn that these devices, like we can do the updates without problems on them, the LCU itself will update your devices. But if you have niche configurations and something that we don't have access to, then turning on diagnostic telemetry gives us more data that allows us to move those classes of devices into the high confidence database.
Okay, next question. On a Hyper-V host that currently doesn't have Secure Boot enabled, do the VMs need to be powered off before enabling it?
Yes.
Is the question about the host Secure Boot or the VM Secure Boot?
I think it's the host. Like if they're deciding that the Hyper-V host, they want to turn Secure Boot on the device that's running the host. That was my reading of it.
So the question's a little unclear because on the host, on every device, you have to power cycle in order to turn on Secure Boot. You can't turn on Secure Boot without rebooting or power cycling. So for the host part, yes, but do the VMs need to be powered off? The VM Secure Boot state is totally separate from the host Secure Boot state. They're not correlated at all. So you have to power cycle the host and go into the firmware menu and enable Secure Boot. if you're talking about the host. If you're talking about on the VMs themselves, then yes, you have to power off the VM, and then you can go into the settings on the VM or do from PowerShell and change the secure boot state to enabled if it's a Gen 2 VM. If it's a Gen 1 VM, there is no secure boot. So yeah, I think you have to recreate the VM and migrate the disk.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Also regarding the certificate update process for Hyper-V, is there an order to do things? Does it matter if the secure boot certificate update process is started first on the host, and does the host need to fully updated before starting the VM? I'm aware of the requirements of the firmware needing to be up to date, at least the March updates being installed on both the host and the VMs.
So I think the answer is the same. Secure boot state in the VMs is unrelated to the secure boot state on the host. When you reboot a secure boot host, the VMs get paused automatically across the reboot. And depending on the VM state, they may automatically restart on the reboot or not, depending on how you have them configured. And no, it doesn't matter if you do the host or guest first.
There was, so in March, we released a fix for Hyper-V where you need to apply the March updates to the Hyper-V host and to the guests to ensure that both pieces of the fix are in place. And then one other thing to be aware of is it's probably less of a worry now, but if any of those devices are on hot patching, the secure boot updates aren't part of hot patches. So the April update is a baseline update where everybody reboots, and that's where you would get a lot of the secure boot fixes that happened in February and March. So next question on tech community. Will Microsoft keep updating the high confidence list after the 2011 certificates expire for devices that we configure for high confidence before deploying? Yeah.
Trying to make sure I understand the question.
Yeah, I'm trying to parse it as well.
So I think the direction where we hope to go is where we stop needing to think about high confidence, because we will learn that majority of the ecosystem is in fact ready to take the updates, and that's what we continue to observe as we make progress here. And we will have a list of blockers that we have also identified as part of the process, where like, hey, these configurations don't support. And so I think the answer to your question is we will not lose the information. We will retain the ability to update devices that we learn are good. Whether the form of it is the form in which it exists today, maybe it'll shift from high confidence to like devices where we have known issues. I think that addresses the question. I'm not sure. Feel free to ask more if needed.
Well, I guess there's maybe another piece to that, is that if some new devices show up in our telemetry after the certificates expire, what happens to those? And I think the answer is we'll continue to apply those to the high confidence database. But it's because I don't think we've talked about how long that will go on. I think probably some of that will be determined by the data that we see.
And Ivan, you made this point earlier, like high confidence database is based on large numbers of successes that we see from our deployments. We have a very broad, diverse ecosystem of devices. And so it is likely there are going to be some configurations out there where we're not seeing that just because there aren't enough of them. And so that's why it's so important that as IT administrators, you're doing those planning steps that we have in our documentation to survey what's out in your environment, see what device characteristics, what device buckets you have, be able to map that to where we see known confidence data versus where we don't have that yet, and use that to guide your own deployments.
Yeah,
And importantly, new devices that ship, in general, new devices that you buy even today don't need updates at all. They already ship with the 2023 certs already up to date. So we expect that as soon as the certificates expire, and even now, we're not likely to see large numbers of new buckets coming into the data and needing that expertise. So once we finish the CFR process and we have come to a conclusion basically on each of the devices that we see, we'll at some point we will be able to ramp that down, and we will have exhausted that
That's right.
data.
New devices was a big area of focus with our OEM partners, and the vast majority of PCs built since 2024 have the new certificates available out of the factory, and so there should be no additional information, no additional steps required for customers to take there.
Okay, so I do want to remind people, I mean, so we're all focused on the certificates expiring in June. So I just wanted to remind people that even when these certificates have expired, that your devices will continue to boot, and you shouldn't see any issues with them. The risk there is that as we start, as we address security issues in the boot manager and the boot chain, that devices that haven't updated to the new certificates won't get those particular security updates. Once those devices do update to new certificates, all those updates will apply. Okay, so next question is, let's say I updated our certificates via Intune or registry keys. What happens if I have to reset UFI for some reason? Will the new certs stay, or will I have to install them again?
That depends on the UFI. Do you want to take this one, Scott? Or
Sure. Great question.
You start, Scott, I'll build on it.
Excellent. It's a great question, and it's going to depend on what is in the DB default and KEC default databases. Those databases come from UFI. They're things that we can't update. So when we deploy the certificate updates, we can deploy to the active DB and KEC databases, but we can't deploy to DB default and KEC default. The only way that those with firmware updates, and new devices that have shipped with them from the factory, already good. You can reset UFI and they will stay. Devices that were updated and have taken a firmware update may have the new certificates and you may be fine. Devices that we updated and added the certificates but have not taken a firmware update in a long time may not have the certificates in DB. And what will happen there is, since the boot manager is updated to be signed with the 2023 certificate, but DB now no longer trusts the 2023 certificate, the device won't boot anymore. So the solution at that point is the UFI EFI application that we have, that you can put on a USB thumb drive and stick into the PC, boot off the thumb drive, and recover.
That's right. And so high in our list of recommended steps for customers as they're going through the secure boot update is to apply the latest firmware updates from your device manufacturer. And many of them have provided updates that will update the defaults as Scott described, and so you won't run into that situation. It may not be all, and again, I'll point back to the OEM support websites that we have linked at aka.ms/getSecureBoot. They have pretty specific information about which models have gotten those updates for the default values. And then as Scott said, if you do run into an issue there are some recovery tools that Microsoft has provided as well.
Yeah. One thing I'll add is to the second part of that question, like, will the new certs, do I have to install them again, right? So you're likely to hit the first problem Scott has described, which is the boot manager will have the wrong certs. You may not be able to boot until you change boot manager or bring in new certs. But as far as the OS behavior goes, like the answer is you will have to deploy them again if they get wiped. But the OS will tell you that. Like the behavior that we have in place is not that we update the certs and then we check a box somewhere that we stop looking for it. We will continuously look for the state of the certs in the DB. And every time we see that they're not up to date, we will warn the users through the events in the event logs, and you will be able to update them again using the same mechanism.
One other related question that I got from a customer, frequently you mentioned, oh, I have to go do that. And in an enterprise environment where you have an IT staff who is managing a large fleet of devices, frequently they're worried about what the user who's sitting in front of the device might do when they don't know what to do for some troubleshooting or debugging steps. And one potential mitigation you could use, and you should evaluate this carefully, is most UFIs provide an administrator password that you could set in UFI. And that prevents people who don't know that administrator password from changing things in UFI, like resetting the secure boot state. So that's a potential mitigation you could use if you're concerned about users who may not understand what they're doing, going into UFI and changing settings that maybe you don't want them to change and may cause the device to not boot. So that's one potential mitigation you could evaluate.
It's important to plan for this, for sure. I think when we've looked at this, we see it as a very, very rare scenario across the broad state.
Okay, next question, and I think this is a good lead into this. Can you confirm, please, if event 1808, absolute confirmation that the certs are all in place and there's nothing left to do? Yes, so this event tells you that all the necessary certificates and the 2023 signed boot manager are in place. And so, so yes, you can count on that being the definitive statement. Yeah, 1808 is great. So
Sure, coming soon.
so and then our back channel is saying that 1808 used to be logged on every boot, and so if the boot manager is updated later after boot, then 1808 will not be logged until the next boot. In the April updates, it was changed to log as soon as the device is updated. Next question. If the boot cert is not updated in an attempt to install a cumulative update that contains updates to secure boot, will the entire cumulative KB fail to install?
No, the LCU will install. So like, I assume this question is talking about after expiration, right? Because as of right now, like LCUs obviously will always install. So let's say the question is, after expiration, you did not update your certs and you're installing an LCU, will the installation succeed? So the installation will succeed. However, it will not be able to update some boot critical binaries, right? So your security posture will be degraded, which is why it's important, and we're doing all this work to enable everybody to get their certs up to date before it gets to that point.
Okay, next question. Oh, here. Is Jason speaking?
Yep. Sorry, I was on mute there, and I was going to ask Ivan a kind of follow-on question on that for clarification. Not every LCU has boot critical components, though, right?
Every LCU will have every update that we've ever shipped for that platform, right? It's a cumulative update. So we've ever shipped. That's a great question, Jason. Thank you for asking that, because I think it's good that everybody knows that. LCUs are cumulative. It stands for latest cumulative update. So if you're taking an LCU on a platform, it has every shipped security and non-security that has ever been shipped for that. So yes, it will have as time goes by, the tendency is that yes, you will have boot critical updates there, and then there's always more security cases coming.
But I guess the nuance there is not every LCU will necessarily contain a new boot critical update. It will have past ones for sure, but fair. Like it may take us, and this is complete speculation, no foresight. It may take us another year before we actually get another boot critical update, or it may take us a month after the expiration. I mean, none of us can predict that at this point in time. So,
well, I think we could use some historical data, though. We tend to ship the boot components in the hot patch baseline months, and I'm pretty sure we've shipped a boot manager in every hot patch baseline month, at least in recent memory. So.
Yeah,
it's a good bet with that one in hot patch baseline months.
Yeah, between the boot critical components, updates to DBX, I think these are fairly common. So I would certainly not bet on a whole year without a case. Like I think a month or so, maybe if we get lucky, but in general, these are pretty active.
Okay, next question. Any particular thing to pay attention to or difference with the process for Azure Confidential Compute virtual machines? So I've been paying attention to this some. I've been working with the Azure team a little bit. This is not an area that I know well, but I did learn a few things. I did learn that confidential compute and trusted launch are requirements for the secure boot state to be preserved over time. So those are the two types of VMs that are necessary. And one of the things that you might be thinking about is when you create new VMs today in Azure, the new certificates will be there. They should be there from the start. If you have images that you're maintaining, those should be updated, like and regeneralized so that the image starts with the 2023 boot manager. So you're maintaining it in two different places. Your VMs are where the certificates are stored, and then the images are where the boot manager updates are kept. That makes sense.
What I'll say about what I know about confidential VMs is that I believe they already have the support for 2023 certs in their UFI for over a year now. So it's more a matter of managing the boot manager transition. So I know some confidential VM customers will curate their own images. So if you're on the path to transition the boot manager there, you should be able to do so, and they support that. Like what they'll do, they'll encrypt your image, right? But they will not modify whatever boot manager you select. So you're free to kind of like migrate at your own pace, and the support should already be in place for it.
Okay, so we have another question here. This one's going to be a longer one. In order to do the secure boot certificate updates, do I need to follow the vendor's steps on updating secure boot certificates? For example, Dell has a website that states prerequisites that it needs TPM 2.0, Windows Server 2022 or later, and then able to update the secure boot certificates. Is it necessary to follow their steps, or can I proceed to update secure boot certificates via registry keys or the playbook that you provided?
I'll jump on that one to start. I just say, as a general pattern, yes, you should follow guidance from your device manufacturer because of the primary reason that doing this big change across our ecosystem is a shared effort, right? It has to have components that the team here is working on in the operating system. It has to have firmware components, it has to have the OEM lined up to deliver parts of those. And so definitely recommend consulting and following through with the recommendations from your vendor. Scott, I don't know if you have any thoughts on the specific order that was presented there, though.
I'm not entirely sure what steps they're talking about. It says prerequisites needs TPM 2.0 and Windows Server 2022 or later, and then be able to do update secure boot certificates. It's not clear to me that there are any specific steps there.
Yeah, we can look at this one online and post a follow-up as well.
Yeah. Also, I think it would be worthwhile for us to follow up on that Azure Confidential Compute one and get some feedback from the Confidential Compute team and post a follow-up online as well. Just because none of us are the experts on that, and we should make sure we get
Yes.
good answer.
Very good. Very good point. Okay, next question. For clarification, is it basic required, or do we need full optional diagnostic data in order to be part of the automated update? The answer is basic required.
Yeah, all the telemetry is core telemetry, so basic required is sufficient. We get everything we need from there.
Yeah. Next question. The new panel in Windows Security was supposedly released in April LCU, but I don't have the new UI. My secure boot status shows green, but I don't have the new certs. Did the update get pulled from the April LCU? This one's a little more complicated. This is talking about the Windows Security application. It's for newer versions of Windows, it's what we call an undocked application. So it gets delivered outside of the operating system cumulative updates. And I believe they're delivering that and over this month and next month. So you should see it show up soon. I don't have the exact schedule on it. And then on a bit older versions of Windows, it is part of the cumulative update. So if you don't see it in April, you should definitely see it in May.
And Arden, is it still correct this is going to show up primarily for consumer systems first?
Yep. Yes, that's right. That's a good question. So it's actually intentionally, these new features for Secure Boot are disabled for enterprise commercial customers. You can enable it in your commercial environment, but it's primarily to help with consumer devices where they're not getting updated for some reason.
Right. So if you're checking from your work PC, you're probably not going to see it. I went PC shopping with my son last weekend, and we looked at a bunch of new PCs, and I happened to look for this. Most of them had the update available, and they all showed that they had the new certs. So it is working there as intended.
Yeah, maybe this is another one where we can come back with the expected, hey, this configuration will allow you to make sure it shows up if you're in enterprise setting. Yeah, we'll follow up on that one.
So next question, have you published a mandatory DBX enforcement date that is explicitly tied to the 2011 certificate expiry yet? Or can you indicate roughly when this is likely?
So no, we have not published that. And by the question, I'm pretty sure they mean revocation of the 2011 certificate in DBX. And absolutely not. We have not published any date when we expect to do that. When we've talked about it in the past, we've said, in order to even consider that, we need this rollout to be saturated and completed. But at that point, we'll start evaluating. We're not even really looking at it yet. And I don't know of any timeline.
I think our public documentation right now says that we will give 6 months notice. But yeah, I think Scott's correct. Getting these certificates deployed is the primary goal right now. And then the next step would be getting media all updated using the new boot manager. and then with all that saturation, then I think we'll feel safe to start the planning or deployment of the revocation of the 2011 certificate. Next question. So what exact checks and data sources drive the secure boot update report in Intune? And does a device showing updated status guarantee the full 2023 secure boot trust chain, KEK DB boot manager, is in place? I don't know if that's Jason, if that's one for you or.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I don't have the full details on whether it's going to show the full chain. I don't think it'll show anything firmware-wise. So if the question is about, specifically like the default certificates that y'all were talking about before, that's not going to show in the report because that's, as you guys indicated, that's something deeper in the firmware, and it's up to the hardware vendors to ultimately maintain. The report will mainly just show the progress, or really the status of what the active certs are today. So if you need anything deeper, then that's something that you'll have to go and coordinate with the firmware vendor. Because again, as you guys talked about, I think Ivan, you explicitly called this out, we don't really have a control over it. And of course, depending upon where the firmware state is, we don't really know either. So the best that the report is going to give you today is the exact status of the active certs today.
Okay, so next question. How do we confirm that a Windows device is actively booting using the Windows Boot Manager signed by the 2023 Secure Boot CA rather than just having the 2023 certificates present or staged in firmware? So that one, it's really goes back to Event 1808 is great, or I think that's our new slogan. Or you can also, there's a registry key that says updated, and in both cases, those both are emitted when the certificates and the boot manager are in place. So.
Arden's answer is totally correct. But if you are running an attestation service, you can also see the certificate in PCR7 that is the actual authority measurement that booted Windows. And the authority measurement in PCR7 will tell you exactly what certificate Secure Boot measured from the active boot binary. So that's a rock solid way to see what we actually booted from.
That's a great answer, Scott. I was gonna say if you want to see the boot manager that's used to boot, you can check your ESP partition. But like the PCR will be like the ultimate, that's proof.
Okay, so next question: is there an official rollback option in case any of any booting issues after updating?
Great question. The short answer is no, because the way the certificate updates work in the UFI firmware is a one-way transition. Once we've changed the certificates in the UFI Secure Boot database, there's no way the operating system can roll them back. From a UFI boot menu, it is possible to reset to UFI defaults or disable secure boot or anything like that. So there are ways to change your secure boot configuration back. But as we talked about before, as Ivan mentioned, Windows will continue to look at the state on every boot. And if you do that and you have been updated, you roll back to the old certificates and replace the boot manager back. Actually, it's a little more complicated than that. Once you update the certificate, when the way Windows TPM Tasks does this, the boot manager
Did we lose Scott?
We lost Scott for a second. I think I can chime in here. I think that where I think Scott was going, at least, is that even though there is not a clear way to roll back, like the way we try and do this is to only deploy the boot manager once we see that the new certs are in place. So like there is no update mechanism. The logic, like obviously there's always a lot of branching, but the gist of it is if we see that user either has secure boot off or already has a 2023 signed boot manager or has the certs in place, right? If you meet one of these three criteria, then you are ready for a 2023 signed boot manager. And in that case, we move forward. What happens sometimes with firmware is that the firmware situation underneath could change, and that's what could create. So there's two kinds of problems. Like one is when in the act of attempting to update, there's some issue in the firmware and the update doesn't stick. In those situations, should not hit boot issues because we will never go ahead and upgrade your boot manager in the first place. But the second kind of problem is the boot manager lands and then something reverts your state, either manual operation or some other problem related to firmware. And in those situations, I think the way to go, what Scott was alluding to, is you can try to either reset defaults or you need to prepare a different kind of booting media with boot manager that's signed with certs that are currently in your UFI trust. I hope that answers the question.
I'll add to that. With these updates in multiple different ways, we're proceeding extremely cautiously. So because of all the data that we're gathering and knowing the behavior of machines, we're moving slowly so that we know that when we do update devices, that they'll update successfully. And in addition to that, the actual mechanisms that update certificates, update the boot manager, and even block the old certificate, all of those are interlocked so that you can't get yourself into trouble by doing them in the wrong order. It won't allow you to do them in the wrong order. Okay, so I think we'll move on to another question. Oh, we got Scott back. Next, it's terrible to be in Paris, I guess. So next question is, what is the WinCS key and what is its exact purpose? What value triggers the update? And I was just looking that up. So so WinCS is a new mechanism that Secure Boot is one of the first places it's being used, but it's a mechanism to help to guide customers on security issues or fixes that are not enabled by default. So in some cases, enabling a security fix in a cumulative update would cause impact on enterprises, and so enterprises and commercial customers need to take steps. And so WinCS is to add some visibility into that mechanism. So and we're making that available to compliance tools and things like that. So compliance tools now look and say, do you have the updates that you need? And this will give some visibility to compliance tools to say, do you have the updates, and are all the security updates enabled, or are there some steps that you need to take? And so that key is just the key that's specific to the Secure Boot update settings. So this was one more mechanism that we're giving customers to know and to deploy the Secure Boot updates.
Arden, do we link to any of those compliance tools on our website yet? I know a number have come out in the past.
I don't know. Who's. I know there's been a lot of talk to, third party compliance tools, but I don't know. I think Travis, who's hanging around with Scott in Paris, probably knows more about it, but we can probably get some more data on the chat later on. Is revoking the old 2011 certificate an action we would need to take, or would that be handled entirely by Microsoft? If Microsoft will handle it, do you know when that is expected to happen? 2026, 2027? I think we kind of covered this, is that we don't have a date for when we're going to do this. We will give significant notice when it's going to happen. But but the alternate side of that is that when your enterprise is ready, it would be better for you to deploy that certificate and block it, because that doing that helps to prevent boot manager rollback attacks, where somebody gets on a device, puts an old boot manager on the device, and uses vulnerabilities in that old boot manager to attack. So it would be good to get to that point once you've made progress with the certificates and your any bootable media that you have.
Yeah, we've talked about bootable media that comes with devices. That's one big category for sure. A lot of customers have their own custom bootable media, network Pixie servers for bootable media. And those are all things that are going to have to be considered to be able to bring them up to the new certs before potential revocation date.
And love those answers. The one thing I would add is, while we talk about doing your planning and making sure you are being diligent, this step I would be extra diligent about, and make sure you've tested through all of your recovery scenarios. And do you have business continuity scenarios? And do you have things that don't happen very often, but you need to know they work? And particularly with the revocation, I'd make sure that you've done thorough and exhaustive testing and planning around that. But once you can do it, as Arden said, yes, for sure, it is a great thing to do from a security perspective.
Hey guys, so a quick question on that one, because this is one I actually don't know, and it's kind of the follow-on here is, what happens if you do revoke it, and then you do discover one of these one-off use cases? Is there a way to unrevoke it? And I think that's the implication here that you're going towards, right, Scott? There is no way to do that.
So there's no way to do that without manual, like we say, administrative action in UFI. So usually that would mean turning off secure boot and resetting secure boot to a default state, rolling back to the original boot manager, and doing a BitLocker unlock, potentially resealing VSM master key. So there are a bunch of things it's a very tricky thing to do, and very difficult to do at scale.
But I think the impact should be that if you do this, is really around any of your external bootable media. External bootable meaning something off of the device. So Pixie boot, or if you have thumb drives that are recovering your devices, things like that. That's really the only place that we expect to have impact, is that when you untrust this 2011 certificate, any external bootable media that has a 2011 signed boot manager won't boot any longer. So that's the impact and where you need to focus.
Yeah, one other quick follow-up there for Scott, because you mentioned this, and I know this comes up in other threads, because people ask, well, can't I just turn off secure boot? And I think you guys can answer, but I think technically yes, but we clearly don't recommend that. So I clearly y'all are shaking your head. I don't know if anyone wants to expand on that one.
Yeah, for sure you can turn off secure boot, but turning off secure boot, like we said, does have impacts. You're going to have to go through BitLocker recovery. I assume you're running BitLocker, and the VSM master key will potentially be lost depending on the circumstance, which means you may have to go through PIN recovery and stuff like that.
Secure boot's a requirement for many scenarios, certainly enterprise compliance. Also in the gaming space, we see a lot of game titles and now requiring the customers come from a secure Windows device, including secure boot. So it is very much a core requirement for a lot of use cases.
Okay, so I'm going to move on. Would there be any changes required in the WDAC policies, since we have policies updated with anything to be allowed signed by CERT Microsoft Production PCA 2011? So when this is going to be replaced with the new PCA 2023 CERT, should we update our WDAC policies with the new CERT? And that one I'm definitely going to go to Scott on.
So there is a mechanism in WDAC that knows to infer trust of the 2023 PCA when the 2011 is present. So there is a mechanism in WDAC that will do that. It's a good idea to add the other certificate and update your policies so they're more explicit. But yes, there is a fallback that does infer trust of the new certificate from the old one.
Okay, so one more question. Will pushing out BIOS updates at the same time as secure boot certificate updates from Intune increase the risk of the device becoming BitLockered?
I think like that's for one boot session, right? It could interfere with the logic, the BitLocker reseal logic, but that lasts one boot session. If you push your firmware updates after a reboot, then there's no longer like any realistic chance of interference.
And as I understand it, firmware updates should not be changing anything. If they've done it correctly, it should not be changing anything to cause a BitLocker recovery. But yeah, I think maybe some of the implication of this question is there a chance that there's going to be some sort of like race condition between the two?
Right, and there are provisions in the logic that we have to update the keys to separate those so that when we detect a firmware update, we will defer updating of the keys already. But like, if you want to be super cautious and like, is there a chance? There is a chance, but we don't expect it to happen, and we have provisions to prevent it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The one thing a firmware update can cause is depending on the BitLocker configuration. So the BitLocker PCR binding configuration is configurable. Devices with the 711 configuration in general should not care about what BIOS updates happen. If the devices are in 02411, that does include PCR0, which contains a hash of the UV image. So yes, sometimes pushing a BIOS update can impact that. And like Ivan said, there is an attempt to avoid deconfliction, but I don't think that logic is rock solid, just because some of this involves things that are happening in the OEM code and in UV code. So we can't be 100% confident there.
Okay, so I think this is our last question. We have Windows updates through Intune to all devices. Half of our devices don't have secure boot enabled. Is there a concern since they don't have secure boot enabled? Will we only be pushing the setting catalog policy to only devices that have secure boot enabled to update certs, or will it update all devices whether secure boot is enabled or not? So we don't. So for devices with secure boot disabled, we do not attempt to update the certificates on those devices. I think if you set the settings on those devices, it will just defer until secure boot is enabled. So I think that's a long question, so I'm not sure I've answered all of that. But I don't think
anything more.
Sorry, I think it's a very interesting question, like Arden said, and I think Scott has answered this in the past. Like, we don't apply the certs update on devices with secure boot off because there is inconsistency in how different UEFIs handle that scenario. So like, because we cannot account for all the different possibilities, like we just don't touch the the DB in that situation. One thing that will happen is the boot manager does get updated. So you will have the latest boot manager, even though secure boot is off. So you don't need the certs in the DB. You will still get the latest boot manager.
Okay, thanks for joining us today. We will have another Secure Boot AMA event on May 18th. You can visit AKAMS/AMA/secureboot/May 2026 to save the date. And thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.